It was supposed to be an easy job. Just 8 hours, 3 nights a week, watching over an abandoned hospital that was, by all accounts, too isolated to attract any real trouble. I'd sit at a security desk in the lobby, walk through empty hallways once an hour, and clock out in the early hours of the morning. Easy, right? The hospital had been shut down in the 90s, left to decay in a quiet part of town that few people visited. People always said it was unsettling. Some local kids even whispered it was haunted, claiming they saw shadows in the windows, heard voices echoing through empty halls. I'd heard the rumors but dismissed them, just as I'd done with every other ghost story since I was a kid. My first night on the job, I sat at the desk, sipping cold coffee, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound in the building. I had an old walkie-talkie clipped to my belt, a flashlight, and a worn-out leather-bound notebook that previous night Watchman had left behind. Curiously, its pages were all blank. I felt silly even checking, but something about the atmosphere here made me want to know if the last guy had anything useful to say. By midnight, my first round had gone smoothly. I'd walked through the main corridors, listening to my own footsteps echo, feeling almost hypnotized by the repeating pattern of tiles underfoot. The hospital smelled like stale air, mixed with a faint whiff of antiseptic that somehow hadn't dissipated even after all these years. It was on the second round that I started noticing the noise. At first, it sounded like a low hum. I assumed it was coming from the pipes, the way old buildings tend to creak and groan when no one's around. But as I moved down the hall, the hum grew louder, warping into a soft, murmuring sound. I turned off my flashlight, hoping that maybe I'd be able to hear it better in the dark. My heart pounded as I stood there in the silent black, straining to make out the words that felt just on the edge of comprehension. But there were no words, only a distorted, muffled noise, as if coming from far down below the floors I was walking on. Then, just as I was about to write it off as an overactive imagination, a soft, breathy voice whispered from somewhere in the darkness, "Come down, please." For a moment, I convinced myself it was just the old building settling, that maybe I'd heard something outside. But it hadn't come from outside, it had come from the hallway, somewhere behind me. Swallowing the panic that crept up my spine, I forced myself to walk back to the desk. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I continued my shift, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes as if expecting to see someone or something lingering in the shadows. The second night, I arrived with a sense of dread that I tried to shrug off. The building was just that, an empty, decaying relic of the past. I was letting my nerves get the better of me. But the hum started earlier that night, barely half an hour into my shift. And this time, it was more than a hum. It sounded almost mechanical, like the static of a television left on a dead channel, blended with the faint crackle of distant voices. I tried to focus on my walkthroughs to ignore the noise. The hum got louder in one specific hallway, near the old surgery wing, which had been stripped bare years ago. Every door I passed was locked and sealed, and the lights here were flickering, casting uneven shadows over the walls. The hum faded slightly as I moved away, only to build up again as I circled back. By now, I had to admit that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Something was actively calling me. When I finished my second round, I returned to the desk, turning the pages of the leather notebook absent-mindedly as a way to distract myself. But there, in the center of a page that I'd sworn was blank the night before, were 2 words, written in a shaky scrawl. Below ground, I dropped the notebook. That wing, the one where I heard the hum, it had a staircase that led down to the old basement where the power generators were located. It was off-limits, closed off after the hospital shut down. The entry barricaded with steel panels and caution tape that now hung limply, half-rotted. No one went down there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had written those words wanted me to go there. By the third night, I knew that whatever was in that basement wouldn't let me leave it alone. That same soft whisper had followed me through every round, and the hum was more insistent, resonating like a pulse in my ears. The words in the notebook had changed, too. A new line had appeared, a warning, or maybe an invitation. "They're waiting for you." I held the notebook in the light. I could see the letters, new, crisp, scratched into the page as if they'd been written moments before. Around 2 a.m., something in me snapped, the curiosity and terror blending until I couldn't resist the pull of the basement any longer. I took my flashlight, steeling myself as I walked toward the door marked "No Entry." The stairwell was steep, narrow, and lined with tiles that had faded into shades of gray and green with age. Each step I took echoed, the hum growing louder, vibrating in my bones, until it felt like a chant reverberating up from the earth itself. I reached the bottom, where a rusty metal door stood partially open, revealing a large empty space beyond. The air was damp, thick with the scent of mold and something else. Something foul that clawed at the back of my throat. In the center of the basement was a shadowed figure, human-like but too tall, too thin. Its limbs seemed to stretch too far, its joints bending unnaturally. And then, as my flashlight caught its face, I felt a chill so profound it locked me in place. The figure had no eyes, only hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb all the light around them. Its mouth opened in a strange, exaggerated grin, stretching wider and wider until it split its face in half, revealing rows of two sharp teeth. Then it spoke, in that same breathy voice that had haunted my every step. "We've been waiting for you." My legs refused to move, my mind blank with terror. The thing lurched toward me, each step echoing in the empty basement as its elongated fingers reached out. In a last burst of adrenaline, I turned and ran up the stairs, feeling its hot, damp breath at the back of my neck with every step. I made it back to the lobby, slamming the door shut behind me. The hum had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up, to go back down. The hum had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up, to go back down. My hands trembled as I leaned against the desk, forcing myself to take slow, deep breaths. That job shouldn't have existed in the first place. The hospital was abandoned, decommissioned 20 years ago. No one could tell me why they needed a night guard, only that someone or something had requested it. When I'd been hired, the security company couldn't give me a straight answer. They just shrugged and said it was a quirk of the ownership, some rich developer who wanted eyes on the building until renovation plans were finalized. The job was easy enough and paid well enough to keep me from asking too many questions. But now, I couldn't help but wonder if that was only part of the story. I sat there for a while, staring blankly at the empty halls. I didn't want to look down the stairwell that led to the basement. Just knowing it was there made my skin crawl. When I glanced at the clock, the hour hand had crept past 4. A couple more hours, and I'd be able to hand in my resignation and never come back. Yet something kept pulling at me. Even as I tried to reason with myself, tried to tell myself I was done, I felt the air in the lobby grow thick and heavy again. And then I saw it. A dark shadow, not quite a figure, lingering just past the edge of the corridor that led to the surgery wing. My throat went dry, and I pressed my back against the desk, gripping it hard enough that I could feel the wood dig into my skin. "Who's there?" I asked, though my voice was barely a whisper. The shadow didn't move. It just hovered, darker than anything in the room. A cold void that seemed to absorb every bit of light that touched it. Then I heard it. That same familiar hum, faint but distinct, beginning to rise from the basement. It pulsed and swelled until it felt like it was coursing through my entire body, a rhythmic throb that left me dizzy and disoriented. I staggered, grabbing the edge of the desk for balance, but as I did, I noticed something odd. The notebook had fallen open again, the pages flipping on their own as if caught in a wind I couldn't feel. I watched, frozen, as the page settled on another entry, written in that same shaky, hurried scrawl. This time it was longer. "We're not done. You're here to watch, aren't you? Don't leave us alone down there." A chill washed over me. The words seemed more desperate, almost pleading. I wanted to believe that it was some prank, but deep down, I knew this was something else, something unnatural. I glanced around, trying to ignore the shadow that seemed to inch closer every time I looked away. The hum was growing louder now, sharper, less like a whisper and more like a chant, the voices overlapping and twisting in a way that made my stomach churn. My mind raced, searching for an answer, any clue as to what this job actually was. What if the developers weren't just trying to keep vandals out? What if this wasn't about security at all? The building itself had a reputation. Stories of failed operations, patients who'd never made it out, doctors who'd left and never spoke of what happened within these walls. Rumors that people saw lights in the windows even though the power had been shut off years ago. I was so lost in thought, so absorbed by the building's strange, unnerving history, that I almost missed the sound of footsteps. They were soft, slow, echoing up the stairs from the basement. The shadow shifted again, and I felt a creeping realization wash over me. They weren't letting me guard this place. They were using me to keep it inside. As the footsteps grew louder, a part of me knew there was no leaving, not anymore. Whatever had been waiting, whatever had wanted my attention from the first night, was making its way up the stairs. The footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, as if savoring each step. My stomach turned with every hollow clack against the concrete, the sound crawling up the stairwell like an intruder creeping through my mind. My hands went cold, every instinct telling me to bolt for the door, but I felt paralyzed, held in place by a strange mix of terror and morbid curiosity. Then came the breathing, a low, rattling hiss, like air being forced through clogged lungs. It was wet, labored, scraping across the stairwell walls and mingling with the growing hum that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. I felt it press against me, and with each rattling breath, I imagined something slithering up those stairs, limb by twisted limb. I wanted to move, to force my legs to run, but my body refused to listen. I was trapped in that lobby, feet rooted to the linoleum, as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting for me to confront whatever had lurked beneath the hospital all these years. And then I saw it. The edge of the stairwell darkened, as if something massive and shifting were blocking out the faint emergency light that hung near the basement. What emerged was a shadow, a thick, oozing mass that seemed to stretch and reform with each slow breath. It had no face, only the rough shape of a figure, as if someone had been stretched and pulled until every human feature was melted away. But the eyes, those empty sockets glistened, as if something alive and wet were squirming inside them. It stopped halfway up the stairs, cocking its head in my direction, and in that moment, I understood. It had been waiting. I was the night watchman, and tonight I was its prey. A low, rumbling voice echoed up from the depths of the basement. It wasn't like the hum or the rattling breath. It was deeper, resonant, as though the building itself were speaking. "You came for answers." I felt the words more than I heard them, each syllable vibrating through the walls and settling in my bones. My throat went dry, and my voice faltered, caught between a question and a plea. What are you?" It watched me with those hollow eyes, a glimmer of something unnatural flashing within them. For a long, tense moment, it said nothing, only swayed slightly in place, as if considering its answer. Then it moved forward, sliding across the floor in a way that seemed both fluid and unnatural, leaving trails of dark, oily shadows behind. Came so close I could feel the chill radiating from its form. When it spoke again, the words were sharp, each one sinking into my mind like an ancient, binding spell. The one who sees, the one who waits. The words made no sense, but I felt their weight. It was watching over something, keeping it locked within the depths of the hospital's forgotten halls. I thought back to the notebook, the scribbled words warning me to stay. I'd been pulled here for a reason, a pawn in some grim game I barely understood. As if reading my mind, it leaned closer, its hollow eyes level with mine. You took the place of those who left, and you will remain. No, the words slipped out in a whisper, desperate and unconvincing. I can't stay here. I don't want any part of this. Its form shifted, dark tendrils stretching out, wrapping around my wrists and holding me in place. Its face, or what passed for one, contorted, its mouth widening to reveal rows of jagged, broken teeth that seemed to drip with some dark, viscous substance. It is not a choice. I felt a pull, something drawing the breath from my lungs, the warmth from my skin. I could feel its intent, as if it were unraveling me, pulling me down into the cold depths where it had waited for so long. With a final desperate burst of energy, I twisted free, staggering back toward the desk. My fingers fumbled for the flashlight, finding it just as the creature began to advance, each slow, deliberate step an unspoken threat. I flicked the flashlight on, aiming it at the thing's face. For a moment, it flinched, recoiling as the light hit its hollow eyes. A strange, hissing sound filled the air, like steam escaping from a broken pipe. It wasn't much, but the light seemed to hold it back, giving me precious seconds to move. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the tiled floor as I sprinted down the hall. I didn't have a plan, didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get as far from that shadow as possible. But as I turned a corner, I heard it again, that familiar, pulsing hum, echoing from the depths below. It was stronger now, filling every corridor, every inch of the hospital, as though the walls themselves were vibrating with some ancient, unseen power. I reached an old set of double doors, the sign above them barely visible under layers of grime. Morgue. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to push through. The hum was louder in here, stronger, almost deafening. And in that moment, I understood. The creature wasn't just waiting for me. It was keeping something else in, something that lay dormant within the hospital's depths. And I was its new gatekeeper. The morgue was cold, far colder than it had any right to be. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay and stale antiseptic. My flashlight flickered, casting brief glimpses of metallic tables and empty, gaping drawers. Then, just ahead of me, I saw a door. A heavy, rusted steel door with a large chain looped around the handle. The hum was coming from behind it, an intense, thrumming vibration that seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the shadow was closing in behind me, its shape stretching and twisting in the darkness, filling the room with a suffocating dread. I took a step forward, my fingers brushing the cold, rusted chain that held the door shut. The notebook's last warning echoed in my mind. Don't look away. Don't let it follow you home. Whatever was behind this door, it was meant to stay hidden, sealed away from the world above. But the creature had let me find it. It had led me here to this moment. Slowly, I began to unwrap the chain, the metal clinking as it slipped from my fingers. My mind raced, part of me begging to stop, to flee. But something stronger urged me on, a feeling that I was meant to open this door, that this was the reason I'd been brought here. With a final, trembling breath, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, the air thick and damp. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, but as I stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of weight, as though I'd crossed into a place not meant for the living. And then I saw them, figures, dozens of them, half-formed shapes writhing in the shadows. They were twisted, stretched, their bodies contorted into impossible angles, their faces hollow, eyes wide with an ancient, endless hunger. They stared at me, their empty gazes piercing through the darkness, as if recognizing me. And in that instant, I knew what the shadow had done. It hadn't just trapped me in this place. It had passed its curse to me. I was now the night watchman, the guardian of this door, this hidden prison where lost souls lingered, waiting for someone to keep them from escaping into the world above. The hospital wasn't abandoned. It was alive, a pulsing, breathing prison holding things that should never see the light of day. As I stepped back, the door swung shut behind me, the lock clicking into place. I knew that if I left, these shadows, these twisted souls would find me. They would follow, pulling me back into the darkness where they belonged. The hum began again, filling the hospital, resonating through my bones. A dark, twisted lullaby that would keep me here, bound to this place, night after night. And as the last of the light faded, I felt the weight of eternity settle on my shoulders, a quiet, suffocating promise that I would never escape. Not while they waited.